Test knitting is one of the most controversial parts of the modern knitwear community, while it continues to remain a common part of the designing process. For example, hi, I'm Nadya. I'm the face behind Lemmy channel where we discuss all things knitting, and I'm an avid test knitter. I absolutely love being part of test knits, but I also have a lot of friends who are either against test knitting, just don't like it for themselves, or are afraid to even try for the first time. So today I decided to dive right into the goods, the bads, and the uglies of the test knitting process. Grab a beverage of your choice and let's get into it. Let's have a small introduction to the matter for those viewers who are less acquainted with this topic. In the most primitive version, test knitting is the process of a designer asking and requesting a few knitters to help them do the proof of concept of their new upcoming design by knitting a few different versions of different sizes of this pattern. After the test knit is done, designer receives feedback on how the pattern works up, and testers receive the final version of the pattern for their use. Now, in this video, I'm not gonna dive into the whole free labor discussion, mostly because I know definition of such words as barter, exchange, trade. I would mostly like to share my own experience as a test knitter to highlight pros and cons of test knitting for both knitters and designers. I would also like to advocate for those designers who genuinely don't share their grievances about the test knitting process on social media to not be deemed ungrateful by the public. And quick disclaimer, I have never conducted a test knit myself, since all of my patterns to date are one size only and relatively simple. So all the thoughts and information I'm going to share from the designer's perspective will be based either on the stories my friends from the designing world have shared with me or on something I saw with my own eyes in the process of me being a test knitter and part of a test group or online on social media. Now let's start on the positive note. Both knitters and designers continue to participate in those test knitting processes, right? And this means that both parties have something to gain from it. And while what exactly this gain is depends on some kind of personal preferences, I managed to combine a list of most popular reasons why people decide to become a part of test knitting process. Let's start with knitters. What do they get from the test knitting? The most obvious answer is a free pattern from the designer they would like to support. While many fiber folks comment online that they don't understand the appeal of spending a lot of time and yarn to knit something just to get the already not that expensive pattern in return, to some the price of the pattern can be a deciding factor on whether they can afford to make it or not. Furthermore, some designers offer yarn support for their testers, which sounds quite enticing. Who doesn't like free yarn? And it's also a normal thing nowadays to gift your testers another pattern of yours as a thank you for their work. Now, for some people, the pattern itself is not the treasure. The treasure is the friends who made along the way, literally. The community aspect is a big part of test knitting. A lot of designers create chats for their testers to talk, discuss projects, and even help each other. This is very rewarding in a lot of ways. For example, I still keep contact with a lot of testers I was a part of test knitting group with. We still engage with each other, we help each other grow on social medias, and we just have lovely chats from time to time. You can get inspired by other projects of testers. You can vent your grievances to people who are going through the same process as you are. For example, on the infinite sleeve island you are stuck on. And even gain some new knowledge from more experienced knitters. Some even say that test knitting is basically a knit along with a Google form to fill in the end. I would say it differs from test to test. Another thing knitters aim for is a closer connection to their favorite designer, or even getting promotion of their socials after the designer shares their projects on their page. If you want to get into test knitting for this reason, though, I have to suggest you lower your expectations. Not all designers like to spend their time chit-chatting with their testers, and the numbers you get on your socials after the designer shares your projects are not worth spending hours and hours knitting up the project for this sole reason. Unfortunately, a lot of people expect to become besties with the designer after getting into the testnet, and this expectation ruins the whole experience for them. Now, for the designers, this whole process is giving reassurance that the whole pattern actually works. They get a proof of their concept, grading and fit expectations, as well as valuable feedback on what they can do better. In the ideal and perfect world, testers help designers find mistakes in the patterns, fit issues, description problems, and other small tweaks to be done. Test knitting also gives designers visibility for marketing purposes. Test calls get a lot of traction online, and photos of finished projects help both with visibility on socials and sales on Ravelry, because people are much more willing to pay for the pattern where they can see photos of this garment fitting their particular body type. Some designers also use the photos made by testers for a whole gallery of testers' works inside the pattern. And sometimes they can ask their testers to use the photos they made for pattern listings and ads. Now, we wouldn't be discussing this topic at all if it was all fun and sweet. As any interhuman process, test knitting can have its downs and can even poison your whole desire to test knit in the first place. The most controversial part of the bads is the stress of having a deadline. Now, I say controversial because while for some people it is causing them a lot of negative emotions to knit to a certain deadline, for others, and especially for us ADHD folks, it makes it more fun and holds us accountable not only towards the designer but to ourselves. The pile of shame of unfinished projects is real and can be very overwhelming at times. But whilst we thrive under the deadline pressure, a lot of people can find it stressful, draining and exhausting to complete projects in a limited time, even if this timeline is fairly long. That is, if you even manage to find a test knit with a proper testing period. Because nowadays some designers lean towards having a very short test knitting cycle, and I would absolutely not recommend applying to such test knits. Even if you're sure you can do it, agreeing to these terms normalizes such a thing and affects all other knitters who want to test knit, and basically leads us to a darker and stressful future. And another kind of stress that knitter can get from the test knitting is competitiveness. Stress of competitiveness. While at its core, test knitting doesn't require you to compete with anybody for anything, our human nature kinda integrated those unspoken rules and elements of competition into it. It can show up in multiple ways, from designers only picking people with a larger following on social media to test knit for them, to a race of who knits up the project faster in the testers chat. I have actually never felt the pressure of needing to knit faster, but it turns out that's because I usually finish the project one of the first people in the test group. So I've never felt it before, but right now I'm test knitting the Fruit Gingham sweater by CM Knits. And since it's my third color work project in a row, I am not knitting fast. I'm knitting much slower than usual. I can tell you the pressure is real. Watching other testers post their cute pictures of finished objects while you are still working on the body can be very discouraging, as if you're failing somehow, even though you're not. The good thing is that you don't have to feel this way. Nobody is going to judge you for knitting slower than others, and it is, in fact, all in your head. Now, the obvious downsides of patterns and testings are them having inevitable mistakes inside, and also you not being able to add modifications as you please, before you finish the test knit, that is. Even tick-edited patterns will have some mistakes in them because nobody's perfect, so if you hate frogging, test knitting might be a bit more challenging for you. My advice would be to always have a lifeline at least every 10 rows. You will thank me later. Modifications-wise, some designers are more open towards letting you, for example, make a more cropped version of whatever you're needing, or short sleeves instead of long sleeve, and maybe different color or techniques used to bind off. But overall, you have to produce the garment that matches whatever is written in the pattern, otherwise this whole process doesn't make any sense, right? The good thing is that you can actually talk to the designer about adding the modifications you would like to make into the pattern, which is a win-win for both designer and you and the knitters that kind of buy the pattern. Now, the most annoying part of test knitting, for me at least, is designers that are not taking criticism well. Some people feel like if people criticize parts of the pattern they wrote, they're criticizing the designer themselves, which is generally not the case. And I'm not saying that designers need to add every single change that testers proposed or wanted them to make into the pattern, but getting offended if somebody says that the garment rise up 4 inches in the front because there's no bust shaping is silly and unproductive, if you ask me. Now let's see the bads from the designer's point of view. If you ask me, the most annoying part will be people not reading the pattern properly. In the age of dictification of everything, our attention span is so small. A lot of testers are literally unable to properly read the pattern without skipping some words or even sometimes sentences. And some people just decide to ignore parts of the pattern just because they think they're useless. And then come for the designer for making a bad pattern and being mean to the designer, which also happens sometimes, and I find it crazy. And all of that leads to a lot of time needed to be spent reiterating things that are already in the pattern or already have been said or written in the chat. This can be very tiring and annoying. Yet designers have to always keep being friendly, cheerful, and patient, which takes a toll on their mental health. Another super annoying thing would be people ignoring the gauge requirements. You might think that having your gauge off by just a few stitches is fine, it's gonna work. But it disturbs the big picture for the designer when you give your feedback on garments measurements in the end. So, and gauge is not only about getting the correct number of stitches, but also about getting the same level of drapiness or thickness as pattern expects you to have. Otherwise, your project won't really have any useful information for a designer to use. There's also a thing that test knitters do without having bad intention behind it, but still negatively affecting the whole process for everybody and the results of test knitting. This thing is not giving honest feedback. Some are scared to offend designers. Some can't be bothered to spend time filling out the form properly. And some think that saying only good things will help them befriend the designer. And in the end, they are basically doing disservice to literally everybody in the process. Because if the designer doesn't know about problem existing, they can't fix it. Just a few weeks ago, I finished knitting up Winnie Top by Lily Kate France, and I was very surprised because the pattern didn't have any additional bust shaping, even though Lily Kate usually has at least some version of bust darts in her patterns. So when I finished the top, the front side was at least a few inches higher than the back because of my boobage area. And the worst part is at that moment, a lot of people will be like, ooh, bad designer. Bad designer making a bad pattern that didn't turn out the way it was advertised. But my first thought, let me guess. None of the larger testers have said anything about it. And after going through projects on Ravelry, I had my confirmation. Their projects had the same problem of writing up, and yet feedback was super positive. Lily Kate even confirmed on Insta that she specifically did not add the buzz darts because testers gave feedback that it's okay. So in the end, everybody is at loss just because no one spoke up about this issue. I've got even more stories from my personal experience. One of them is related to deadlines, but from the side of the designer. Now, on average, about 70% test knitters complete the project on time and manage to give feedback before the deadline. So designers know they need to plan on at least 30% of loss in terms of feedback. But what if only 2 testers out of the whole test group finished the projects in the time that was given to them? This is precisely what happened when I was on my first test knit for Kate Create Designs. It was picnic sweater pattern last summer. And we had quite a generous testing period. But unfortunately, by the end of test knitting, only me and one other tester have completed the sweater. Not a lot of feedback, huh? And even a month later, there was not much progress on other testers' works. And half of the group completely ghosted Kate and just disappeared. Because of that, Kate was not able to release the pattern in the summer season, which led to her sales being much lower than expected. Because no one wants to knit a summer sweater in autumn. So if you're interested, check out this cute sweater on Ravelry. All these stories mean that designers need to also motivate their testers to actually finish projects that they agreed to test. Some gift patterns only if you finish the project, some make gift cards as a giveaway for those who finish the project, some divide the pattern in parts and don't give you the whole pattern until you're finished. But all of these are just workarounds and don't always help. Now let's get into the real dirt and talk about some really snarky things. Some of these things are stories I heard from, and some come from the depth of the internet. But what these stories have in common is how unhinged they are. Let's start with some things that designers have asked from their testers. There are some stories about designer being mad at tester for not posting enough project updates during the test knitting on their socials, and even confronting a test knitter for not following them on Instagram. I really hope that designer who did the latter discussed this with their therapist, because what in the world of insecurity is that? Oof! There were a few cases of testers' photos being used for marketing purposes without their actual consent, but these cases were mostly quite some time ago, and nowadays designers are much better with paying attention to these matters. A fun story I found on Reddit claims that designers sent the pattern in parts, and after sending the first part, they ghosted the tester and stopped replying to any messages while still being active on social media. In Russian, there's a saying that describes the situation very well. We'll buy a bus ticket and then walk instead, just to spite the ticket inspector. Also, we live in 2026, so there are a lot of stories about patterns and testing looking suspiciously AI written, and I can't say it surprises me anymore. But I really hope, though, that people will call out designers that do that, because I refuse to let AI ruin my favorite hobby. Another story I found online was about a pattern being not actually finished by the time test knit started. And to make matters worse, it was one of the test knits with strict and very tight deadlines. So you don't have the full pattern, and also you have to knit very quickly. This is just a nightmare fuel. But I haven't found any awful stories coming from designers about test knitting online, but I'm pretty sure it has to be connected to designers not wanting to get dragged for whining about the free labor they are getting. People are pressed nowadays. But the most common cases of things happening to designers are, for example, people taking the pattern and then ghosting the designer, just like it happened with Kate. So basically they steal the pattern, they don't do the work in return, so the whole exchange part kind of disappears. And sometimes they even upload these patterns that have not been yet tested to file sharing websites, and sometimes even try to sell them on Etsy. I don't even want to get into this topic because I already discussed it in details in my knitting piracy video. If you want to check it out, it's gonna be somewhere on top. Another common thing happening is people leaving fake reviews about either the pattern or the test knitting process itself because they were mad at the designer for not becoming besties with them. The entitlement. And from my own experience, I noticed that a lot of people who did not hit the proper gauge and just decided to go with it faked their feedback. in the end and add measurements from the pattern instead of the real measurements they got. They're basically faking the results so the designer is not mad at them for not following the pattern. Every day, we're further and further away from Jesus. After all these being said, I want to reassure you that test knitting can be a very good thing for both knitters and designers, but only in case if it's done with respect from both sides. So if you're worried about getting into your first test knit or about conducting one, just remember that you deserve to be treated right no matter what. Look for test calls for patterns that have been tech edited with long testing periods and with promises of support and help from the designer. Look for testers who have extensive notes on the projects that they've made on Ravelry. Do not go for testers who don't write any notes anywhere about what they've done. And don't forget to always treat people around you with kindness. Otherwise, none of this makes sense. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.